Welcome back. After we had the pyramid, Lantos instructed Cindy to find other pieces of glass for other tools. So we called up that company in Germany and we asked them if they made any other tools. And they said, yes, that's what we do. We're a glass company. So we asked them to fax out to us photographs of all of the different pieces of glass they were currently making. So they faxed out dozens of pages of photographs of various tools, various pieces of glass that they were making. They were literally being made as desk artwork, as paperweights. And then Cindy took that stack of faxed photos, had them on her bed, and she showed them to Lantos. Now, when Cindy talks to Lantos, a lot of people use the term channeling. But this is not actually accurate for what Cindy does. Cindy's never had the ability to channel. Instead, what she has, her eyes have the ability to physically see the wavelength that Lantos appears on. Her ears have the ability to physically hear the wavelength that his voice can be heard on. So it's really no different from if you have a dog sitting next to you and someone 1 kilometer away, half a mile away, blows a dog whistle. You're not going to hear anything, but the dog does. And it's not because the dog is channeling the dog whistle. It's simply because the dog's ears can pick up that sound. And this is the same thing with Cindy and Lantos. When she talks to Lantos, what she does is she calms herself physically. She sits down usually. She focuses on the desire to speak with Lantos. And then a few moments later, Lantos shows up. And then Cindy carries on a physical conversation with Lantos. She will physically write down the words that he says, but that's only so that she has a verbatim, a word-by-word transcript of what Lantos gave as an answer. And then she gives them to me, and I get to tell you what Lantos said. But aside from that aspect of her writing down what he says, it is no different from you calling a friend of yours, inviting your friend to come over to your house for a cup of coffee or tea and conversation. You just sit down on the couch and you start talking to your friend. That's exactly the way it is with Cindy and Lantos. So when Cindy had this stack of these faxed photographs, she sat down, she calmed herself, focused on the desire to speak with Lantos. Then Lantos simply showed up. Cindy explained that these were the photographs of the various tools that the company in Germany was currently making. And then she held up each photograph one by one for Lantos to look at. Most of the time, Lantos would look at the photograph and say, it's very beautiful, but not really for our purposes. So Cindy would set it aside in a pile. But every now and then, she would hold up a photograph and Lantos would say, yes, that is the flame of Genesis. Or yes, that is the biotranslator. And Cindy would set it aside in a different pile. We then took those photographs, faxed them back to the company in Germany, and we said, we're going to start ordering a lot of these tools. Oh, and by the way, we're going to start calling it the flame of Genesis. And that was how we developed the first 7 or 8 tools of BioGenesis. They were already in existence, again, as desk artwork, as paperweights. It's just that they were made of pure glass. And that meant that when they went into the Genesis device and went through that training period where they took on the Genesis energy, they would come out of the Genesis device holding the Genesis energy, and they would then be able to radiate this energy to their environments without degradation. All of the tools hold the same energy, the Genesis energy. It is the shape of the tool that determines how that energy is going to be radiated into the environment. And that determines what the energy is going to be able to do. So, for example, we just finished talking about the pyramid. The pyramid gently radiates the Genesis energy to its environment to establish a stable foundation of harmony and to remove negativity. The flame of Genesis, in contrast, focuses and directs that light of Genesis. And that makes the flame much more effective at restoring harmony to a number of conditions within the physical body. The flame of Genesis is effective at restoring harmony to physical traumas, non-functioning body organs, degenerative diseases and conditions, as well as many other things. When we got the flame, we unpacked the box of the flames. We put them all in the Genesis device. They went in and out several times through that training procedure. They came out holding the Genesis energy within them. Mom took one of them and she sent it overnight to one of my cousins who lives in Missouri. My cousin was really interested in the flame, wanted to see one quickly, so Mom sent it overnight to her. She received it the next day. That next day, the day that she received it, her father, my great uncle, injured himself. He was out mowing his backyard, but he had a very large backyard, so he had a tractor mower, a rider mower. And he was riding this tractor around his backyard, mowing the lawn, and he fell off the tractor and it went over his leg. The mower part of it went over his leg, and that meant that it cut out a large chunk of flesh from his leg. He went into the hospital. The doctor at the hospital took a look at his leg and he wasn't optimistic. He explained to my uncle that because of his age, my great uncle was in his 70s, that meant that his body was going to take a lot longer to heal this severe of a wound. And in fact, it was so severe, his body may never heal it. But that wasn't the part that concerned the doctor the most. My uncle was also undergoing chemotherapy for cancer. Because of that, his immune system was compromised. The doctor explained that this was a severe wound that was going to be an open wound for over a year. And during that period of time, infections would come in. My uncle would be exposed to lots of infections. Because of the chemotherapy, his immune system was going to be weakened. And that meant that those infections could be life-threatening. For that reason, the doctor thought it would be better for them to simply amputate the leg. And my uncle didn't like that option. He asked the doctor if he could think about it for a little while, and the doctor said, sure, come back in a week. So my uncle went home that night. He was sitting on his couch watching the news on TV in his living room. His daughter came over and she had the flame that she had received that afternoon. She said, Dad, do you mind if I try using this on your leg? And he said, sure. Now my great uncle, a great man, but he didn't believe in this at all. He said yes, because he wanted his daughter to be happy, and he knew that if she thought she was doing something to help out, it would make her happy. But he was just going to watch the news on TV. He wasn't going to pay attention to it. So she started using it over his leg while he was just watching the news on TV. He told me immediately it started to feel like needles were going in and out of the wound quickly. He was still watching the news, but he actually stopped. He said, Deb, you're gonna need to pull that thing out just a little bit. He thought she was digging around the wound with the flame. He looked down and he saw that it was a few inches, several centimeters away from his leg. That caught his attention because he figured, for better or for worse, this thing is actually doing something. It's making it hurt a lot more. So she pulled it out to be about a foot away from the leg. Then my uncle told me that sensation of needles going in and out quickly switched to a sharp tingling sensation throughout the wound. Well, his daughter only did this for about 2 minutes that evening. She did it for 2 minutes each evening. At the end of the week, my uncle went back into the hospital to see the doctor. The doctor took one look at his leg and he said, we're not going to need to amputate. This is healing a lot faster than I thought it was going to. So he sent my uncle home, scheduled him for a checkup of 1 month later. My cousin continued to do this a couple minutes each evening for the next month. After a month, my uncle went back into the hospital. The doctor took a look at his leg and he said, this is amazing. We're going to need to schedule you for a skin graft. He then explained to my uncle that when you take a large chunk of flesh out of the body, the skin won't regenerate itself. You have to graft it from another part of the body onto that area. It's just that the doctor thought they were going to get to this point after perhaps a year or a year and a half, not after a month. So he scheduled my uncle for a skin graft 4 weeks later. My uncle went home, and my cousin continued to do this for a couple minutes each evening over my uncle's leg. 4 weeks later, he went back into the hospital for the skin graft. The doctor took a look at my uncle's leg and he said, "I'm not entirely sure how this happened, but your skin regenerated itself. We're not going to need to do the skin graft after all." That was the very first experience that we had with the flame, overseen start to finish by a physician. From that point on, we started telling people you might want to use the flame on external physical traumas, such as cuts. And since then, we've had a lot of experiences with external physical traumas. I was giving a lecture talking about this early on, back in 1999 or 2000, and a man in the class raised his hand. I called on him. He said, "My horse kicked me." He explained that he had been grooming his horse. He walked around behind his horse, and the horse kicked him straight on into his knee. The man went to the hospital. The doctor there took an MRI, came back in with the results. He explained that the man's ACL was torn and his MCL was torn, and the kneecap was displaced. So the doctor scheduled him for surgery 3 days later, gave him a temporary air cast and some crutches, and sent him home. On his way home, this man stopped by a friend's house. This friend happened to have the flame. They sat down on a couch. His friend grabbed the flame. He started using it over this man's knee. They talked for about an hour, and the man used the flame the whole time over his knee. At the end of the hour, his friend asked him, "So do you feel any better?" And he got up and he walked around a little bit. He said, "Yeah, I feel a little better." Now, this wasn't actually true. He didn't feel any better at all, but he wanted his friend to feel like he had appreciated the effort. So he said, "Yes, I feel a little better." And then he went home. 3 days later, he went back into the hospital for surgery. But this time, when he went back into the hospital, he went in without his crutches and without the temporary air cast. And his doctor saw him walking in normally. So the doctor said, "You know what? Let's take another MRI before we operate." So they took another scan. The doctor came back into the room with results. He said, "Well, your ACL is no longer torn, and your MCL is no longer torn, and your kneecap's exactly where it's supposed to be. So why don't you come back to us next time you actually need us for something?" That was our very first experience with an internal physical trauma using the flame. So we started telling people, you know what, you might want to use this on torn ligaments. Since then, we've had a lot of experience with torn ligaments. In fact, one of the great things about BioGenesis is that you don't have to be an expert in order to use the tools. The tools use the energy perfectly, regardless of who's holding the tool. It's sort of like using a flashlight. You don't have to be an expert to use a flashlight. You push the button to turn it on and you point it where you want the light to go. It's the same thing with the tools. You take the flame, you point it where you want it to go. Then you just move it around in a circular or side-to-side motion, and that energy will still go perfectly. There is a woman in New York City, in Manhattan, who lived in a tall apartment building there. She went home one day. She got off the elevator, she was walking down the hallway to her apartment, and her next door neighbor was unlocking the door to his apartment. But this time, he had crutches, and the last time she had seen him, he didn't have crutches. She asked him what had happened. He explained that earlier that day, he injured himself. He tore his Achilles tendon. He went into the hospital. They took an MRI. The doctor came back into the room and showed him the MRI, and she said that his tear in his ACL was 9 centimeters long. So that's a significant tear. In fact, it was so significant, she explained he was going to have to do surgery, but he was probably going to have to do 2 or 3 surgeries because she was going to have to graft part of another tendon onto the Achilles tendon. She was thinking they were going to take part of the big toe tendon. because this was too big a tear to even heal with surgery on its own. There was a problem. This man didn't have health insurance, and he didn't have the money to pay for 3 different surgeries. And he explained this to the doctor. He said, "Is there any way that I can just do physical therapy?" And the doctor said, "Sure, you can get by on physical therapy, but you will have a significant limp. You are not going to heal this fully just with physical therapy." But the man knew he didn't have the money for surgery, so he figured that was just what he was going to have to do. He explained this to his neighbor, and she said, "Wait here." She went into her apartment. She came back out with the flame. Now, this man had never heard about biogenesis. He didn't know anything about biogenesis. He didn't know anything about the flame. She, his neighbor, told him, "This will help. Take it, point it at your ankle, move it around in a circular motion. Do that for 5 or 10 minutes each evening." She gave him the flame. So he started doing this. A couple minutes each evening, he used the flame. A month later, he called up the doctor. He asked if he could come in for another MRI. And she said, "Sure. Is something wrong?" And he said, "Yes, I think I may have severed the tendon completely." And she asked, "Why? Are you in extreme pain? Can you not walk at all?" And he said, "No, that's just it. I'm walking perfectly and I have no pain at all." She said, "Well, then I can tell you, you did not sever the tendon, but come on in, we'll take a look at it." So he went back into the hospital. She took another MRI. She was in the room with him, in the exam room with him, when an assistant came in with the results. She opened the envelope, pulled out the results. Her first words were, "My goodness." She looked up at the man and she said, "It's completely healed." She showed him the scan. There was no tear left in the Achilles tendon. That's from someone who didn't know anything about biogenesis. We have a lot of experiences with external and internal traumas such as torn ligaments. I was talking about this at a lecture in Madison, Wisconsin. We were in a large conference room full of people, and a woman at the back raised her hand. She stood up and she said, "Last night, my horse stepped on my foot and broke my big toe." I was thinking, for some reason, we're getting a lot of horse-related injuries with this tool. Well, she explained to the class she's a nurse in St. Louis, Missouri. Her husband is a doctor, a physician. They have a large piece of property. They have horses on their property. She was out the night before feeding the horses, and one of them stepped on her foot and broke her big toe. She told the class, "I knew it was broken when it happened. I not only felt it, but I heard it." She heard the crack. She limped back into the house, showed her husband. He said, "Yeah, it's broken." She said, "What do I do? I have to go to this seminar tomorrow." He said, "Ice it. Put ice on it." So she grabbed some ice from the freezer, put it in a baggie, sat down on the couch, turned on the TV, put the ice on her toe. Half an hour later, her toe hurt a lot. It had turned black and blue, and it was swollen. She couldn't move it, and she said, "Well, I've had enough of this." She put the ice away and she grabbed her flame. That wasn't even her flame. It was her neighbor's flame. She had borrowed it earlier that afternoon for something else entirely. She thought, maybe this will work. So she turned on a different TV show that she wanted to watch. She grabbed the flame. She started using it over her big toe. She used it over her foot for an hour during that TV show. At the end of the show, when it was off, she turned off the TV. She put the flame away and she went to bed. She woke up the next morning, the morning of the seminar. She told the class, "I woke up this morning and my toe wasn't broken. There is no bruising. There is no redness. There is no swelling. There is no pain. I can walk on it. I can kick it. I can do whatever I want with it. I showed it to my husband. He said it's not broken." She paused and then she walked up the center aisle of the room. She said, "Actually, I wore sandals today so that you could see. My toe looks better this morning than it did yesterday before the horse stepped on it." Well, that was our very first experience with what we suspected was a broken bone. We didn't know for sure because she didn't go in for an x-ray. All we knew is that a nurse and a doctor both thought it was broken, and then the next morning it wasn't broken. So then we started telling people, you might want to use the flame on broken bones. Since then, we've actually had quite a few experiences with broken bones, many of them verified with x-rays. We had a doctor in Florida call us up one Monday. She said, I need that flame of Genesis. I need it quickly. Can you send it overnight? We said, sure. And we shipped it overnight to her. The next day, she called us back. She explained what had happened. She told us that she received the flame and that she was going to use it on her son. Turned out that the previous Friday, her son had been bicycling and he fell off his bike and he injured his ankle. He came home. She looked at his ankle. She's a medical doctor. She thought it was sprained. She said, well, it's sprained. Stay off it for the weekend. It'll be better. He stayed off it for the weekend. Monday morning came around. He couldn't put any weight on his ankle at all. It was swollen, it was bruised, and it was very painful. So she knew it wasn't sprained. It was something more. So after breakfast, she put him in the car, drove him to some friends of hers, a couple of orthopedic surgeons who had their own office. So she drove him over there, had them x-ray his ankle. One of the surgeons came back in with the x-rays, put them up on the lighted screen. He said, well, this is why he can't walk. And he showed her the x-ray and the 2 fractures in his ankle. Her son had broken his ankle in 2 different places. She took her son back home. This was now on Monday. She had read about BioGenesis in an article in a magazine, so she looked up that article. She remembered the name of the tool, the Flame of Genesis. She looked us up. She called us. She asked for the flame to be sent overnight. We shipped it to her, and she got it on Tuesday, the next day. When she received it, she told us that she immediately used it on her son's ankle for about an hour and then stopped and did other things. That evening, her daughter came over for dinner. Her daughter was also a medical doctor. She saw the flame. Her mother told her about the flame, and she said, I want to give it a try. So she used it over her brother's ankle for another 45 minutes after dinner. So that day, he had an hour-long session and a 45-minute session with the flame. The next morning, so now Wednesday morning, the doctor was in the kitchen making breakfast, and her son walked down the stairs for breakfast. He walked into the kitchen normally, without even a limp. The doctor saw him walking normally, and she told us her very first thought was, there is no way this happened. After breakfast, she put her son in the car, drove him back over to her friends, the orthopedic surgeons. She said, humor me, take another x-ray, please. So they did. And the doctor came back in with the x-rays and showed her there were no fractures left in her son's ankle. It was completely healed. They went out to the car, she and her son. In the car, before even leaving that parking lot, she called us up, excited, and she said, this was in less than 24 hours. We have a lot of experiences using the flame on internal and external physical traumas. Now, in all of those experiences, the trauma happened recently, within a few days of when the person was using the flame. But we also have a lot of experiences using the flame on long-term physical traumas, traumas that happened a long time ago. It still works. It still restores harmony. I was giving a short introductory lecture, really only about 20 or 30 minutes, in Atlanta, Georgia, one evening. Afterwards, people wanted to come up and play around with the tools. I was giving a weekend seminar starting the next day, Saturday, and a lot of them were going to come to the weekend seminar, but they still wanted to play around with the tools. There was a woman who came up, grabbed the flame. She turned around and she started using it over her tailbone, over the base of her spine. It was a little awkward trying to do that, so another woman grabbed the flame and she said, here, honey, let me do that for you. So she just started using it over the woman's tailbone. There was a line of people waiting to try out the flame, and this woman was feeling a little embarrassed, a little self-conscious. So after about 5 minutes, she said, okay, that's enough. The woman using the flame said, no, it isn't. You still need more. And she kept doing it for another 5 minutes. So after 10 minutes total, then the woman said, there you go, honey. Now you're good. And that woman left. She didn't come back to the seminar that weekend. 4 months later, I came back to Atlanta to do another seminar, a follow-up seminar. And the woman showed up to that seminar. And when I was talking about the flame, she stood up and she shared her experience. She explained that she had been to that lecture that evening. She explained what happened. Then she explained why she was using the flame on her tailbone. 30 years earlier, she had broken her tailbone in a skiing accident, but her accident didn't happen on the slopes. It happened at the lodge. She was in ski boots and she went outside and she walked down some concrete steps, but they had snow and ice on them. She slipped, she fell, she landed right on her tailbone and badly broke it. And it never healed properly. Ever since then, she explained, she had severe pain in her tailbone at the base of her back. And it was exacerbated, it was made worse whenever she sat down in a chair, which was a problem for her because she had a desk job. She had to sit in a chair all day long for her job. She said that she could only bear to sit down for 5 minutes at a time. After 5 minutes, the pain was too great. She had to stand up, walk around, it would dissipate the pain. She'd go back and she'd sit down for another 5 minutes. She grabbed the flame that evening of the lecture because she wanted to see if it would help her broken tailbone, and it didn't. The woman had used it for 10 minutes. She didn't feel anything. She didn't feel any better. It still hurt. She walked away thinking, well, that sure didn't work. That's why she didn't go to the seminar that weekend. But over the next 3 days, the pain gradually disappeared. At the end of 3 days, there was no pain left. She was thinking, so it did work. But let's see how well it worked. Let's see if the pain comes back. 4 months later, she came to that seminar. She told the class in the last 4 months, she hadn't had any pain at all. She was able to sit at her desk all day long without taking breaks, without any pain at all. So it doesn't matter how old the trauma is. Recent, old, the flame will still restore harmony. External trauma, internal trauma, doesn't matter. Even intentional traumas, such as surgeries, the flame will still restore harmony. It's very effective at restoring harmony to physical traumas. The flame is also effective at restoring harmony to non-functioning body organs. We found out about this because of my family's dog. Back in 1999, during the summertime, my family took a vacation. We were gone for a week, and my dad's secretary was dog sitting our dog. When we came back, early morning before my dad went into the office, he stopped by his secretary's home to be able to pick up the dog. It was then that the secretary told my father that she thought the dog was really sick because he hadn't moved in a day. He had just been lying on the floor, and he hadn't had anything to eat or drink in a couple of days. My dad knew that the dog was sick because when he walked in the door, the dog didn't even jump up to greet him. He just laid on the floor. So my dad picked him up, put him in the car, and drove him over to a vet, dropped him off there. Then my dad went off to work. A few hours later, the vet called up my father, and he explained that the dog was in complete renal failure. His kidneys had shut down completely. The vet explained that he was in such bad condition they weren't even going to try to treat him. They were simply going to give him fluids and painkillers so that he would be comfortable as he died. My dad didn't really like that option. So he called me up and asked me to go get the dog and take him to a different animal hospital. So I did. I went over to that vet, picked up the dog. The vet gave me the blood tests. I put them in the car, put the dog in the back seat of the car, drove him over to an animal hospital. In the parking lot there, I crawled into the back seat of the car and I grabbed the flame and I used it for about 5-10 minutes over the dog's kidneys. Now, I don't actually know where a dog's kidneys are, but I sort of went between the front and the back legs and I figured they were probably there somewhere. So I simply did that. Then I carried the dog into the animal hospital, met with the vet there, handed him the blood test results from the previous vet. That vet looked over the blood test results, and then he looked up at me and said, "I'm really sorry, but with numbers like this, there is no way he's going to live. he'll probably die tonight. So they did just give him fluids and painkillers so that he would be comfortable as he died through the night. The next morning, the vet called up my father. He said, well, your dog is still alive. We're going to wait until after lunch. We're going to do some more blood tests then. That afternoon, the vet called up my father. He said, you can come pick up your dog. He's completely healthy now. My dad was at work with a patient, so he called me up. I went over to the animal hospital. The vet came walking out of the back area with the dog on a leash. The dog was walking along fine, like nothing had happened. The vet handed me some blood tests. He said, these are the tests we ran at lunchtime today. His kidneys are at 100%. He's completely healthy. Well, we didn't know if that was just a coincidence. We didn't know if maybe the flame only worked on kidneys or only worked on dogs or maybe only dogs' kidneys. But we started telling people you might want to use the flame on non-functioning body organs. Since then, we've had a lot of experiences with this. I gave a seminar down in Florida. Oh, this was probably back in 2002, 2003, somewhere around there. I gave a seminar down in Florida, and the woman who had helped organize the seminar was standing at the back of the room. She raised her hand. She said, Dave, Jack is here. He's got an experience I want him to share. So this man towards the back of the room stood up. He cleared his throat. He said, yeah, my name is Jack. I had terminal heart disease. Ginger, the woman who gave him the treatment, gave me a treatment, and now I'm better. And then he sat back down. His wife was sitting next to him. She turned and she looked at him and she said, oh, you don't know how to tell a story, do you? So she stood up and she told the story for him. She explained that he had heart disease, that he had been diagnosed with heart disease, and over time the disease progressed. It got to the point where his doctor had to surgically implant a defibrillator in his heart. And his disease continued to progress. And it got to the point where his defibrillator was firing between 20 and 50 times per month. And his disease continued to progress. It got to the point where his doctor told him that he was going to die, that there was nothing more that they could do. And it was then that the man decided he would try something else. A friend had told him about this woman in town who had these glass tools and gave treatments and gave lectures, and he decided he would try it out. He called up, found out they were having a lecture that evening. So he and his wife went over there. His wife drove him over to this woman's house so that they could see this lecture and try getting a treatment. He walked in the door. Ginger, the woman who gave him the treatment, told the class, when he walked in the door, he looked dead already. He was completely gray. His complexion, totally ashen. She said instead of continuing with the lecture, she just wanted to give him a treatment right then. She said, well, let's see how we do a treatment. So she had a massage table. She had it out. He got on the massage table. She gave him a treatment using the various tools, going all over his body, but especially over the heart. She told the class that the entire time, she gave him a long treatment, about an hour and a half long treatment, and the whole time she just kept praying in her mind. She said over and over, she just kept saying, please God, don't let him die on my table. That was the only thing she was worried about. She thought he was going to die any minute. She just didn't want him dying on the table. Well, he didn't. He lived through the treatment. At the end of the session, though, he didn't have enough energy to walk around, to leave. So he actually moved to a sofa and he rested on the sofa for another half an hour. And then he got back up off the sofa and slowly walked out to his car, and his wife drove him home. And 11 months later, I came into Florida to give that seminar. And in that 11-month period of time, his defibrillator had not fired a single time. That was when the man, Jack, stood back up for the class. And he explained that he now had full energy, full strength. He had started golfing again. He had no symptoms of heart disease. He told the class that he had actually quit his job as a civil engineer and started going to school to be a chiropractor. He said, well, I figured that now that I've got a second life, I'll actually do something I enjoy this time around. We have a lot of experiences with the flame and non-functioning body organs, especially with heart disease. This is something that we have quite a few experiences with, just as with that man, Jack, in Florida. There was a medical doctor in Chicago who called us up one time. She had heart disease as well, and she had a little problem in that she was having heart attacks, a lot of them, and they were going to kill her. We said that we would go ahead and do a seminar in Chicago so that she could attend and learn how to use the tools. And a lot of her patients were going to come to the seminar anyway. We scheduled it. It was going to be in 2 weeks. But she didn't think she was going to be alive in 2 weeks. She needed something earlier. And in a day, we were going to be doing a seminar in California. So she and a couple of friends of hers, 2 other medical doctors, flew out to this seminar in California so that she could learn how to use the tools and start using them for herself. It was a Saturday and Sunday seminar. Saturday afternoon, we were getting ready to do sessions for people, treatment sessions for people. And she came up to me and she explained, now, I have a defibrillator and a pacemaker in my heart. Is it going to be safe for me to do the treatment session? I didn't know the answer. So I told her to give me a few minutes. I went to the hotel room. I called up my sister and I told her what was going on. And I said, can you check with Lantos right now to see if it's safe for me to give this woman a treatment? Cindy called me back a couple minutes later, said that she had spoken to Lantos. She told him the situation, asked if it was okay to give this woman a treatment, and his answer was, we invite the miracles to come. So I told the doctor that was his answer. She could decide whether she wanted the treatment. She said, well, I came all the way out here for it. Let's go ahead and do it. She lied down on a massage table. I started using the tools. I especially used the flame over her heart. We did about a 20-minute session that day, about a 20-minute session on Sunday. The next day, then she flew back home to Chicago. And 3 days later on Wednesday, she had another heart attack. But this one was a mild heart attack in her car, in her driveway, right as she had parked her car coming home. And that was the last heart attack that she had. That was 10 years ago. She has no sign of heart disease. The flame of Genesis is also effective at restoring harmony to degenerative conditions and diseases, such as multiple sclerosis. Remember the woman up in Madison, Wisconsin, at that class, the woman from St. Louis, the nurse, whose horse stepped on her foot and broke her big toe? She was using a flame that she borrowed from her neighbor earlier on in the day. The reason that she had borrowed a flame was for her daughter. Her daughter had MS. Her daughter was 32 years old. She had been diagnosed with MS 18 months earlier. During the first 6 months after her initial diagnosis, she had significant limitations in mobility. She wound up in a wheelchair. During the next 6 months, so by the end of the first year after her initial diagnosis, she was significantly limited in mobility. She was bedridden. She could be out of bed for about an hour a day in her wheelchair. 18 months after the initial diagnosis, she had to be force-fed each meal. She had no energy. The woman across the street, the neighbor across the street, had watched as this young, vibrant woman who had been a college professor was stricken by this disease and just taken down. The woman across the street happened to have a BioGenesis kit. She knew the tools would help, but she was embarrassed to say anything about it. She explained to the class, we live in a conservative suburb of St. Louis, and the mom's a nurse and the dad's a doctor. What was I supposed to do? Go across the street and say, I've got healing tools? But after a year and a half of watching this, that's exactly what she did. She went across the street, rang the doorbell. The mom answered the door. She said, I've got these glass healing tools, and I'm not sure, but I think they might help your daughter. If you'd like me to try, I'm happy to use them on her. To her surprise, the mother said, well, let's give it a try. She went home, she got her tools, she came back, and she gave a long treatment session to the daughter, using the flame especially. Then she took her tools, went back home. A few hours later that afternoon, that evening, the mother called her up and she said, "Would you be able to give her another treatment tomorrow? She's actually feeling better. She feels like she has more energy." The neighbor said, of course. She was excited about this. She was thrilled that they liked it. The next day, she went over that afternoon, gave the daughter another treatment session. This time, she left the tools there so that the mother would be able to use them whenever she wanted to. A few hours later that evening, the mother called her up again. She said, "Is there any way that we can learn more about these tools? She feels a lot better. She has more energy than she's had in a long time." And the neighbor said, "Well, let me check." She called us up, found out that we were doing a weekend seminar starting the next day up in Madison, Wisconsin. It was a close enough drive for them. So they all decided they would drive up the next day. Then about an hour later, the mother was out feeding her horses, and one of them stepped on her foot and broke her big toe. She came back in and used the flame that she had borrowed just a few hours earlier that afternoon. Well, the class, that weekend class, started on Friday evening. And Friday evening, we started the class with everyone walking up to the front of the classroom, the front of the large ballroom, to introduce themselves. When it was the daughter's turn, she came up in her wheelchair and I helped her up and carried her, and she introduced herself to the class. Then she went back to her seat. Saturday morning, we didn't see her. She was back in her hotel room, and her mother was giving her treatments throughout the morning. In the afternoon, we saw her a little bit, but a lot of the time she was in her hotel room and her mom was giving her treatments. Sunday morning, we didn't see the young woman either. She was still in her hotel room and her mom was giving her treatments. Sunday afternoon, after lunchtime, the young woman walked in the ballroom, this large conference room. She walked right up to the front as I was getting ready to start. She grabbed the microphone from me. She looked at the class and she said, "I have an experience I'd like to share." And of course, we could all see that she was walking, and she was walking without any difficulty. She said, "First off, I had lunch today. For the first time in over half a year, I had an appetite. I was hungry, so I had a big lunch. Then after lunch, I walked outside, barefoot." She explained that her goal for the last 18 months had been someday she was going to be able to pluck clovers with her toes. She explained all of the paralysis was gone in her, even in her toes. So she went outside and she plucked clovers with her toes. She went back to her seat and watched for the rest of the class. She and her mom and the neighbor went back home to St. Louis that evening. Her dad was thrilled. Needless to say, he was excited about this. He said, "Okay, next class, I'm going." Our next seminar was 1 month later in Colorado, but he had a medical emergency with one of his patients. He wasn't able to make it, but the grandmother and the mother and the daughter drove out for that class. When we started that class, the young woman, the daughter, walked up as everyone else was walking up to introduce themselves. When it was her turn to introduce herself, she walked up to the front of the room and she scooped me up in her arms. She turned to look at the class, holding me completely in her arms, and she said, "1 month ago, David had to hold me up in front of the class so that I could introduce myself. I just thought I'd return the favor this time." And then she set me down and she explained that she had no symptoms of MS. She had energy, she had mobility, everything was back to normal. She went back to her seat and sat down. They went through the weekend seminar. Sunday afternoon, as we were finishing, her grandmother stood up and spoke to the class. She had tears in her eyes as she spoke. She told the class that the saddest day of her life was the day that she had to get her late husband's wheelchair out of their closet, put it in her car, and drive it over for her granddaughter to be able to use. She said, "I came to this seminar for one reason. I figure that if I could learn to help one person the way my granddaughter has been helped, then I would be able to think that I had led a successful life. They drove back home. 1 month later, we got a call from the mother, letting us know that she and her daughter had just completed the 500-mile El Camino walking trek through Spain. The flame of Genesis is effective at restoring harmony to degenerative conditions. Let's go ahead and take another short break.